Hello, my name is Robert Morgan, and I'm a game writer and a narrative designer, whatever that is. And the birthday boy. Yeah. All right, hello. So this is part 4, yes, of a series about game stories, how they work, why they so often don't work. It's partly an exercise in finding a way to put to good use what I spent 3 years studying, which is literature, which meant that quite a lot of the time I spent having to learn technical terms like these. Just at the start, the ones that look most like invading alien races from a game from the 90s, these two, I just thought I'd go into these a little bit more because people have been asking about them. So these are technical terms for metrical feet, which is a way of describing how the rhythm in poetry works. No, I don't know why they're called feet, when really they're often named after fingers. The word dactyl means yeah, there we go. It means like a pterodactyl. It has a finger. It's the shape of your finger, which means it's a stress and then 2 short stresses. Da, da, da. Shakespeare used it quite a lot. So, for example, a spondy, yeah, it sounds like somebody who you would be really embarrassed about losing to in level 1 of a Sonic game. That's 2 stresses. Da, da. And it's a way of describing how rhythmic scansion in poetry works. So this is a dactyl, 1 stress followed by 2 short stresses. Forward, the light brigade. Was there a man dismayed, etc., etc. It's a way of technically describing things that happen in poetry that people gradually worked out without using the technical terms. This stuff started before people had a name for it. And people had developed these techniques before people had squashed together a bunch of Greek and Latin to come up with a technical palette of terms to describe it. But it's still important because it means that even though you don't, it's annoying to have to memorize those terms, it's useful because it gives you a technical toolkit to describe what's happening in a poem. And I wanted to try and start doing that in games as well, because we have loads and loads of things that happen in games all the time that we'd all recognize as things that happen in games all the time. But we often don't have ways to describe them, which means it's hard to maintain a collective memory of them, because the best way we have of describing what's happened in a game is often, oh, it's like that moment in that game that you played. Do you remember when you played that one? No, possibly. If you didn't play the game, then you miss out, and you miss out on a chance of comparative knowledge about games, which is why it's a shame. The benefit of having this in literature is you have a technical palette of terms, so you can say things like Dickens is fond of deploying pathos, rather than simply saying Dickens loves making you happy right before killing the little girl again and again. And, well, they're not always little girls, but, you know, the emotional impact is roughly the same again and again. Eat your heart out, George R.R. Martin. We have these kinds of things in games, but they're cliches. They're because they're observances about what happens in games. They're not terms, technical terms for the way that the game actually works, which is why I wanted to start thinking about how we can kind of build up a palette of ways of describing how games works and put them in hashtags, because God knows nobody likes a Latin term. So we've talked a lot about how games tell stories, but today I want to talk about how we tell stories about games, via games, through games, whether we're talking about how we played them and what a great time we had playing this game, or more commonly, I think, actually, how we end up telling ourselves a story as we play the game, with the game as just the starting point. I think it's something that the best games encourage us to do. And in many regards, it's something that only games do, or games are the best medium to get us telling ourselves story. And this is partly because it's generally a good rule of thumb in game writing that less dialogue is more. I'm a game writer by trade. This isn't just because brevity is the soul of wit, apparently. But also because, to me, the aim of storytelling in games, my job as a game writer, is to do just enough to get the player telling themselves a story and then get that out of the way as much as possible. Because as writers, there's no version of the story that we can come up with that'll be better or feel more right than the story the player tells themselves. Even though as a writer we might be able to look at the story the player tells themselves and critique it and say that, oh, this is desperately uneven. This is dreadful storytelling. It's their story, and that's really important. And that's a far, far better story, not only for that audience, it's a far better use of the medium to get users telling themselves that story. A lot of writers see their purpose to be to get as much wit down on the page in the shortest number of words possible. But one of the most important lessons I learned is that in games, cleverness is only good if it doesn't take away from the player's sense of ownership of the story. And why? Because cleverness is overrated. This is something I learned from writing for Failbetter, who of course are immensely clever but deploy just enough cleverness in just the right ways. They work with the story in the player's head, and I think that's what the game writer's job is to do. You set up the player's expectations, and then you fuck around with the player's expectations. That's the fun part, but you're cooperating with the player. You don't finish the story, the player finishes the story. Now, this doesn't mean that the player does all the work. Oh no, that's why I get paid the big bucks. That's what it says here. But curating how this works, working out how to release just enough story to get the player telling themselves an interesting yarn, working with the user, that's the real trick. Because, of course, the player can't feel in total control, Dickens gives us death in his books because it's a way of simulating how real life works. Terrible and unjust things happen for no reason all the time, and we just have to get on with it. If we let players control and create the world around them to feel like the world is theirs to control, well, there's a danger they'll end up telling pretty boring wish fulfillment stories rife with that mythical creature, the Mary Sue, where everyone gets mostly what they want. And that's fine for some games like Minecraft, but it's not too great for games that try and tell stories. On the other hand, if you can make the player feel like the world is against them, that's a starting point for making something more interesting happen. Which brings me to tonight, the Pathetic Fallacy, which is a technical literary term that you'll definitely know what it means when you see it in action, because it's one of the most common devices in all of literature. And it's also one of the most characteristic, one of the most bloody typical examples of the solipsistic sesquipedalianism of the literary mind. And it's also a lie. So what does this mean? It was coined by the art critic Ruskin in the 1840s, and it describes when a writer kind of assigns or ascribes or accredits human emotion or human context to an object to which human emotion simply isn't relevant. So, for example, the sullen clouds, or the watchful forest, or the indifferent rocks. They're describing these things in human terms, when really human terms are irrelevant to the objects as objects. Possibly the one that seems most relevant is the indifferent rocks, because technically they don't give a shit. But they're not indifferent any more than they are lonely or ugly. They're rocks. I mean, this is assigning human thought to something to which it's basically irrelevant. Now, Ruskin didn't necessarily think this was always a bad thing. He presented this poem, naturally he wrote it, and he said that this was an acceptable example of the pathetic fallacy. They rode her in across the rolling foam, the cruel, crawling foam. Foam neither crawls nor is cruel, says Ruskin. However, it reflects a mind unhinged by grief in the context of the poem, and therefore, it's kind of justifiable. We see that the feeling is true, and so we pardon the inaccuracy. We're even pleased by the fallacy, not because it fallaciously describes foam, but because it faithfully describes sorrow. It's a good way of describing how someone's mind might be working, which is to assign apparently paranoiacally human motives to things which actually don't have any humanity to them at all, like the sea. Ruskin used the term to criticize the sentimentality of the Romantic poets, but it's worth bearing in mind that Ruskin also applied the fallacy to when a poet, or really anyone for that matter, described a crocus flower as gold, because it's clearly saffron. Clearly. Do you even have eyes? Where did you learn to utter oik? The problem with all of this, well, really, the whole idea of the pathetic fallacy accurately describes something that humans do all the time, which is to anthrocentricize things, to make things people-focused, to think of things in human terms. It's like when we talk about environmentalism as saving the planet, as though we have the technology to destroy the planet. If a few changes in degrees in temperature one way or another is not really going to bother the planet very much. Really, we're trying to save our own species. From the perspective of the planet, it's probably longing to be rid of the apparently fungal infection that covers its surface. Except, of course, it isn't, because it's just a planet. It doesn't give a shit. So this idea, the pathetic fallacy, has a mixed critical heritage, but at least it allows us to describe something that happens all the time in literature, even if we don't want to get into the argument about how false this thing is or not. It's a common and a characteristically human thing to see the world as a place of human logic, because that's how we experience the world. I mean, I don't personally think that the world is designed for us, per se, but it kind of feels that way sometimes. And literature is the art of recording the human experience, so literature has a duty to reflect this. But what does this mean for games? Because in games, everything you see was made for you. It was made to tell you a story. It was made for a specific reason. You are the center of the world in a given game. And attributing human logic to that world does make sense, because at some point and at some level, it was designed by a human. If the mountain seems indifferent or tempting, it's because it was made that way, whether it's a faithful recreation of a real mountain or something entirely imaginary. The mountain that we see at the start of Journey, for example, it's a temptation. It's an objective marker. It doesn't have a giant exclamation mark above it, but it definitely is. We know it, we recognize it in artistic terms, because it was designed that way. So what does this pathetic fallacy thing mean in games where everything around you reinforces what would otherwise be a falsehood? It reinforces the idea that everything exists for a reason, that it makes sense in human emotional terms. How do games respond to the world when the way they're designed isn't how the real world works? Now, this isn't one that we can come to a neat conclusion about, or at least not tonight, because it's complex and my own thinking hasn't settled and games are changing all the time. I do think that the pathetic fallacy has something to teach us about what it is that makes games so different to other literatures. So let's get into it. Why games? Well, Tarkovsky said that a poet is someone who uses a single image to express a universal message. And he considered himself a poet, and he happened to use film. And a film, is a constructed artificial world. We go into it, things are supposed to hopefully make sense, at least more than real life does. It's fertile ground for the pathetic fallacy. So why are games any more complicated than films in these terms? Well, I think the difference is interaction, or more accurately, ownership, which is kind of the consequence of interaction. It's what interaction gives you, a sense of ownership. Because a film isn't really designed for us to take ownership of the story, however ambiguous the story is. We and our decisions are not the center of the action. We might feel like a film has been made for us, but it's still done, it's wrapped up, it's finished, and then it's handed over to us. It's not all about us, but games are, games can be. And I'm not just talking about games with strong protagonists, or even just games with stories. If the thing wouldn't happen without you, then it's pathetically fallacious, because it's unlike the real world, which sadly would go on much the same without you. For those curious, I turned 30 last week. So what does this look like in a game? Let's take Uncharted 4. I'm not going to do any spoilers. We don't have the need for the Tetris theme this time. Now, I had my problems with this game. What I'm going to talk about is a relatively minor and spoiler-free gripe. But I also think it's quite telling of the way we make games, and games' confused relationship with the pathetic fallacy. So it's a very self-aware game, and not just because the first third of the game basically takes place inside Naughty Dog's trophy cabinet. It also talks a lot about itself as you're playing it. Now, one of the new mechanics is sliding down slopes. This isn't a great image, but you slide down slopes a lot. And as you spend a lot of the middle levels doing this and having physics puzzles to do with it, as you do so, there are comments from Drake about how scary the slopes are and about how he started to get stones in his shoes. It's classic Naughty Dog stuff. But increasingly he starts talking about how many of them there are. At one point he actually says, after a long tricky sequence of slopes, he says, phew, do you think that's the last of them? Now, this is what we call hanging a lampshade. How many people are familiar with hanging a lampshade, the term? Okay, about half. So for those of you who don't spend a lot of time on TV tropes, the stack overflow of storytelling, the reason it has a lampshade in its logo is because hanging a lampshade is probably the most common modern ironic literary device there is. Hanging a lampshade is where you acknowledge something. You turn to the player, you turn to the audience, and you wink and you say, how did that happen? We don't know. Why is it that Team Rocket keeps surviving? Why is it that Team Rocket get out of every single trap that they're put into? Who knows? The writers don't know. But here we are. They make that joke. It's hanging a lampshade on it. They get the writer out of a pickle that the writers have got themselves into, and they make a self-aware, ironic joke about it in the course of doing so. So, in Uncharted, a writer sat down and wrote the line. Whew, do you think that's the last of them, those slopes? Whew. And it's to start a kind of ironic dialogue with the user. But there's a problem, because Drake is highlighting how numerous and, in my opinion, tiresome the slopes are, at the very point when I was thinking, man, these slopes are numerous and tiresome. I think they've got the flow wrong here. This feels a bit slow and overlong. Drake can comment on how annoying the slopes are because, from his perspective, he's at the mercy of an arbitrary, precarious, uncaring world. Why are there so many slopes between me and my goal? God, I don't understand why. But we understand why, because somebody put them there. The world was designed for us, So when it highlights how there's too much of something, it kind of steps out of irony and it becomes a contradiction, it becomes a little bit too much smugness. Now this isn't just to single out Uncharted 4, because this is actually a fairly common thing, and it's getting more common as games get more ironic. But I think the best way to highlight this is to ask the question, what would have been worse? If Drake said, "Do you think that's the last of them?" and it was the last of them, and they were making a joke about how that was the last of them, and he's glad, and he doesn't know, but it is. Or would it have been worse for him to say, "Do you think that's the last of them?" and then you turn the corner and there's a load more of them? They've put themselves in kind of an impossible position by making this level of ironic joke, and both outcomes would be just as smug and semi-ironic as the other. And why? Because cleverness is overrated. This is from Oglaf, by the way. I have to give credit where credit is due. And the Uncharted series, the whole thing, it's this meticulously curated card simulation of an uncaring, arbitrary, dangerous world. Things always break. The drain pipe will always break. They'll always drop you over a precipice. But it happens every time. The pathetic fallacy isn't really pathetic here, because it's reasonable to ascribe human-like context and emotions to this world, because it really is after us. It's really trying to give us the most exciting time. In the real world, it's not really meaningful to describe a mountain as having too many slopes, unless you're going to go home and give it a bad Yelp review on, I don't know. It can't have too many slopes, it's just a mountain. But it's semi-reasonable to say in Left 4 Dead that the AI seems to have it in for me, because the AI was designed to have it in for you. In the real world, if you just got done dealing with a load of zombies and then some more come around the corner, there's no point in saying why, unless the zombies are in some way kind of a sign of the rapture, in which case there's evidence that there is a God after all, and then you might have some business asking why. There's definitely no point in saying this mod seems poorly designed, or the flow of this level really seems quite over the top, or baseball bats are OP in this scenario. But there's a lot more to it than me just ragging on Drake. A lot of games find ways to avert this a bit, especially where they deliberately try to create an environment that is uncaring, that is arbitrary and indifferent. This is my single tweet review of Far Cry Primal. The game sets up an environment where things happen in combination, and they're interesting, but they're not narrated, they're not necessarily curated, they're not cutscenes. So we start telling ourselves a story about it. You don't need to come up with an elaborate tale of ursine revenge to account for this happening in front of you. I did. But the minute you think it's interesting, or more interesting than something else, that this grisly murder, arson, suicide pact happened, the instant that this is more interesting than looking in the river and going, "Oh, isn't it interesting that that rock is next to that rock?" We're telling ourselves a story, because the game is designed to be a machine for stories, in the words of Mary Hamilton, who I think is speaking next month. If it had been a curated moment, if the bear-on-bear violence had happened in a cutscene, we might be able to talk about what it meant, or what it said, or what it implied about Ubisoft's attitude to bears. But it was emergent, so what does that mean? Let's put it another way. Does it feel different? Does it feel different to you, substantively? If you're on a story quest of some kind, say, and you're nearly at the end, and then you encounter the boss, and the boss is a bear, and it kills you. I was nearly at the end, difficulty spike, I'm going to get on the forum, and I'm going to give Ubisoft what for their pro-bear agenda. Does that feel different to when you've nearly finished a quest that you set yourself? You've decided to go out and you've gone out to unlock a new camp, a new fast travel zone, and you're nearly there, and then the dynamic engine spawns a bear right in front of you. And it takes you by surprise, because it's not a carefully designed boss battle. The bear literally just spawned in, and it's just as confused as you are, and it kills you. And you reload back to checkpoint, and you have to slog all the way back out there, and you're like, "Oh fuck, I was nearly there." Is there a substantive difference between those two? Designed, partially designed, not designed experiences? Because I think so. Games, especially system-driven or part system-driven games, they can give us a bit of both. In real life, it's a contradiction to say you were murdered by a bear, because they can't premeditate violence no matter what my dad says. They can't, much less have dour, sparsely shot documentaries made about them. But in a game, someone is responsible for creating that hazard. The bear has been put there. or partially put there. The possibility of the bear has been put there with the express purpose of killing you, or at least of making your life exciting. And they created it in such a way that encompasses how you died. They created the possibility. If only the National Trust took such good care of its users and gave them such an exciting time. The bear sort of deliberately killed us, and it sort of didn't. We might swear at the bear in both cases, but for different reasons. Because games can give you the experience of being shit on by an uncaring world, and of being shit on by a diabolical, cackling mission designer, and somewhere in between, which really is a lot like life. There's actually an interesting parallel to the pathetic fallacy in the world of animal psychology. Thanks, Wikipedia's nonsensical related articles category. It's called Morgan's Canon, which is why I'm featuring it, because all the evidence I can mount up that I really am the center of the universe is just fuel for my final confusion that the world is really run for my benefit, just as we all secretly suspect, right? Look out for my 6th and final lecture in a couple of months, Morgan's prerogative towards a poetics of, haha, you're here now and you have to listen to what I say. Morgan's Canon. It's coined by a 19th century British psychologist, C. Lloyd Morgan. It states that when studying the behavior of an animal, the psychologist should, under no circumstances, interpret their activity in terms of higher psychological processes if you can fairly interpret those activities in terms of their lower psychological activities which take place lower in the scale of psychological evolution. So what does this actually mean? Well, essentially, do not create an elaborate psychological drama or an anthropocentric path to describe or account for an animal's behavior when you can account for the behavior with a simpler explanation, like the animal was hungry or the animal was confused. No, your cat does not have a rich and tortured psychological backstory worthy of a telenovela which you can invoke to account for why it's unable to display affection normally, and instead it's only able to do so by acting out and performing transgressive yet intimate behaviors. It's a cat. It probably just likes shitting in your slippers. Please note, I am of course not talking about your cat, who is undoubtedly the specialist snowflake and really understands you. I swear she does, and one day perhaps you will understand her. It's all a bit like Hanlon's razor, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Now, not only would this be a useful rule of thumb for governing if something is worth arguing about on the internet, which of course would rule out 99% of discourse on the internet. There isn't a grand conspiracy, promise, no matter how good the game is or how artistic the creator, they probably at some point just felt, oh, I just want to get it finished. God, I just want to get it out the door. So we might equally describe it as never assume deliberate design when the quirks of an arbitrary system could adequately account for it. And that includes the arbitrary system of making games. And there's still more to this, because a game is an artificial environment. We know that it's there for us. We're trained to see it as there for us. We often think of it as being deliberate, even if they're not. But in games, they usually are. And even if they're not, there's usually no difference. If it appears that you're being disproportionately killed by bears, you might make a conspiracy theory that the designers ramped up the difficulty quickly at crunch time by just spawning more bears in a certain area. Then that's your experience of the game. Even if it is just a coincidence, it's still bad design. If you feel like the bears are after you, it's still bad design if you can go online and complain about bear-centric difficulty padding, even if it's an accident because the game is a designed environment. If you treat the mountain as a playground from your perspective, then it's fair to say that it's a badly designed mountain, too many slopes, 2 out of 5, would not mountaineer again. This is a genuine Yelp review, by the way, of a national park in the States. Just remember that from the mountain's perspective, it's probably thinking, there's far too many of these monkey-like creatures in overpriced North Face jackets climbing up and down me all day long. I can't wait until they die off and something more interesting comes along. Or, except it's not, because it's just a mountain. Sometimes we act like the world's a system, when it isn't. And sometimes we act like it's governed by an emotional logic, which it also isn't. We experience the world sometimes as a story in which we're the hero, but sometimes we experience the world as a chilly and indifferent place, because things do happen for no reason, and we do just have to cope with it. We experience both at the same time, because that's what humans do. And it's interesting to me that so many games talk about fate so much, as a way of perhaps excusing how linear their narratives are, when really games teach us that fate is bullshit. And unlike other literatures, Games have the capacity to simulate and respond to all of this. They can give us an arbitrary world where there is somebody making some decisions. They can give us a world which feels like it makes sense, but which also has a cold and indifferent logic to it. They can give us environments where we can build something extraordinary and then have it taken away in an instant. And then, depending on your preferences regarding difficulty, you might be able to reload and get the extraordinary thing that you built back. And that's why I think that games have the potential to talk about and show us the losses and the struggles of real life in ways that other literatures can't. They can show us what Ruskin said. It feels true, and so we pardon it, or we enjoy it. We enjoy the fact that it's fallacious, or we enjoy the fact that it's arbitrary and indifferent, because it's a way of responding to the real world. Because we're starting to see games that are part system and part story, just like the real world is. In The Charge of the Light Brigade, in that poem we talked about at the start, Tennyson has to plan and carefully position all of his words to make them feel and sound the way they do. They're supposed to sound like hooves pounding. They're supposed to sound like an accusation. They're supposed to sound like he's highlighting that somebody got something wrong. And yet, in games, we can make the player feel that something's gone wrong right down into their thumbs. Sometimes the bear was just trying to peacefully relieve itself behind a bush, and you blundered in and you scared it half to death, and oh my god, the bear chipped a tooth on that awful, the skull, humans. But sometimes the game designer just enjoys shitting in your slippers. And sometimes it can have been one of these, it could have been something entirely arbitrary, but we can convince the player that it was something designed. And that's when games get really interesting. That's where we get into what Siobhan was saying about how games can still be fun and even really cool, even more cool when they're not perfect. Which brings me to my own project. With Jake's permission, I'm bigging this up. It's next weekend. It is an augmented reality, site-specific audio drama. If you're interested in how it works, you walk around a space with your headphones in and it tells you a story depending on where you're standing and where you're going. If you're interested in that, come and grab me afterwards. That's where I want to leave it. Thank you very much.